For a very brief introduction, this subject, when we talk of statecraft, establishing a state, has several layers, four levels of it. We go back to Purusha Sukta. Any subject, as we discuss, it has several levels. It has a worldview level. So, in fact, the Purusha Sukta says, "Padosya Vishwabhutani Tripadasya Amritam Devi." So only the manifest layer is what we get to see, most people. But what underlies it is what really is governing it, and that has itself several layers. The real three legs that are governing the fourth or resulting in the fourth. So in that sense, in the statecraft, in context of statecraft, the instruments, the policies, laws, all that we get to see in the manifest form, they are only the visible fourth leg. Underlying these is an architecture of a state. Underlying the architecture of state is a doctrine and character of state, and underlying that in turn is a worldview from which all this is emanating. In the context of statecraft, constitution remains our foundational text, and Smriti remains our foundational text in a Dharma Rajya. We still want to take a small detour looking at the nature of those texts and consequently what kind of state they are going to result in, and then come back to how we can realize this. So, if we look at a Smriti or a Dharma Shastra, its content is primarily ontological and prescriptive. It is a refutable document. It has itself based on more axiomatic text, namely the Shruti. So there is an axiomatic text, there is a derived text, there is a systematic way to refute it, change it, alter it, and restructure it. Whereas constitution is more a gospel. It's basically, it expresses a wish, saying this is what we want to establish, and then it tells this is what we want to do. Now the problem in this is it's rather arbitrary. It can be modified definitely, but it's not refutable document. It's, if we cannot refute a document, there is no structured way of changing it. There is only an arbitrary way of changing it. And that's primarily where we have currently the problem. And a Dharma Shastra also has different layers in its text. There is an eternal or universal, which is Sanatana. Then we have a Yuga or the temporal layer. This is less permanent, but it gives large patterns of human conduct and things like that. And then we have a Deshakala or a time space specific layer. This layer keeps changing from time to time, and its orientation can also change. Whereas in constitution, there is nothing like permanent. It is basically always known to be temporary, because by its own definition, constitution is representation of will at that point of time. So it can always change. But what is basic about it is some fundamental ideals that are uncompromised. Now, these ideals themselves, do they have an ontological basis? Can they be refuted? Can they be altered? There is no structure to that. That structure lies completely outside the debate of constitution. If that is done and somehow translates into will, then it can reflect in constitution. Then the applicability of the text of Smriti, it has, because it has these multiple layers, there is obviously one universal layer where everything applies, and then there is a law of land distinctly called out, where the law, based on the nature of that law, even that is elaborately explained within the Dharma Shastra, saying this is the nature of this land, therefore this kind of law should apply to this. Now constitution only says this is the law that applies to this land. There is no rationale as to why it applies. It is assumed that people know why it is applying. And as a result of all this, the nature of institutions that these result in are going to be very different. Institutions of nation will be there, that the Smriti prescribes. And then it also takes cognizance of institutions of society. without trying to prescribe them to the society. It takes cognizance of society as it is, whereas constitution tries to tell how a society should be and then tries to define it. Basically, nation controlling, state controlling the nation. Also, constitution assumes a moral scheme. It doesn't systematize a moral scheme either. It just says that because it is again reflection of public will, what public morality is, it will get reflected into constitutional morality. Whereas the Dharma Shastra explicitly spells out its assumptions. It is systematic in that sense. It says this is my scheme of morality and this is how uh, people are. Because people are of this nature, now I am going to give laws that are going to be like this. Constitution also claims or craves protection of rights, and it prevents abuse of power by the executive. Whereas goals of the Dharma Shastra, goals of life according to Dharma Shastra are basically the Purusharthas. Towards fulfillment of Purusharthas, the duties of state are prescribed. The next part is the religion. Basically, the democratic state can be secular. In general, state can be either secular or theocratic. There is no clear uh, holistic view of this thing. There is a assumption of power struggle between church and state. Whereas the Dharmashastra doesn't see any such thing. It knows that the institutions of society are different. Religion doesn't come into state or the other way. But the fundamentals of how a man is, they remain the same whether it is religion or state. It's basically a worldview that is underlying this. So that worldview is taken cognizance of and explicitly spelled out. And there is no religious profound dichotomy drawn by the Dharmashastra. And it is agnostic of tradition. It doesn't discriminate one from the other. Though it doesn't claim to do that, its inherent principles result in it automatically. And it also acknowledges that people have traditions, people have their innate craving to follow their traditions, and makes enough checks and balances around those. Neither does it give excessive freedom. If the law is clear, any violation of law will be dealt with, no matter what tradition it is. The most important difference is Constitution assumes society is organized, whereas the Dharma Shastra is designed primarily for inherited societies. Inherited society does not just mean genetically inherited, it's basically a continued tradition of knowledge, a civilizational experience that is evolving this social organism over time in a continuous way.